Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It is great to see that you have all joined us by Zoom today. Today, our distinguished guest is Dr. Robert Redfield, the former director of the CDC. How are you doing today, Dr. Redfield?
Very good. Thanks for having me, Klaus.
Thank you for joining us. I will introduce Dr. Redfield to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Today, we are talking about biosecurity, which is quickly becoming a U.S. national security priority. We will talk about the coronavirus, which caused the COVID-19 pandemic only a short while ago, and we will talk about the possibility that there might be yet another pandemic just around the corner. We will also talk about the causes of COVID-19 and the role of China and how we prevent and manage future infectious diseases such as bird flu. Our event today is entitled Biosecurity, a U.S. national security priority. Our distinguished guest will make some brief initial remarks of 10 or 15 minutes, and we will then have a frank conversation about the challenges of biosecurity. This will be followed by Q&A from you, our distinguished Zoom audience. You are welcome to ask many written questions by using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Let me also mention that, as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again and again. They are all worth watching, of course. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions in writing to our speaker today. Let me briefly introduce our distinguished expert today, Dr. Robert Redfield. Dr. Redfield is a U.S. virologist who is best known for his work on HIV/AIDS and for his tenure as the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, from 2018 to 2021. During his tenure as CDC director, Robert Redfield had to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and how best to protect the country from the virus. He also had to look into the question of the causes and the origins of the crisis. This, as you will know, led to deep political conflict between the United States and China. Dr. Redfield obtained his medical degree from Georgetown University School of Medicine and completed his residency training in internal medicine at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He served in the U.S. Army Medical Corps for 23 years and retired as a colonel in 1996. He then co-founded the University of Maryland's Institute of Human Virology in Baltimore. In the profession, Dr. Redfield is particularly well known for conducting groundbreaking research on HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s. To the general public, Dr. Redfield became a household name as director of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from 2018 to 2021. These were the tumultuous years when Donald Trump was president and when Dr. Redfield's colleague, Dr. Anthony Fauci, was director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. I think we all remember the regular press conferences and other meetings and events during which Dr. Redfield tried to explain the coronavirus situation to the general public and perhaps also to the president himself. At present, Dr. Redfield is a disease and internal medicine physician at the Greater Baltimore Medical Center in Towson, near Washington, D.C. It is a distinct honor to have such an outstanding expert join us today at the Krasno Global Event Series. Thank you for coming to us, Dr. Redfield. Let's begin without further ado. May I ask you to start with your initial remarks, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. The traditional threat for biosecurity that we've all grown up with are largely thinking about China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And we've built over the last 20, 30, 40 years a fairly extensive defense industry, largely driven by the private sector, about $800 billion a year, to really respond to that threat. But it's clear that in the last 5 years, 10 years, that threat is evolving. I know you recently had a discussion on cybersecurity as a national security threat. I'm here to talk to you about what I believe is the most pressing national security threat for the United States, and that is biosecurity. And I would argue that we need, as a nation, to mount a response that's proportional to the threat. And I would suggest that as we sit here today, we do not have a response that's proportional to the threat. So if you take a minute to step back and reflect really on the recent COVID pandemic, New Year's Eve in 2019, I got a phone call from my office in Beijing, China. U.S. CDC has a office in Beijing, China, and they called and told me there was 27 cases of an unspecified pneumonia that was not flu and was not SARS. And the next day, or later that evening, I had a call with my counterpart, George Gao, who was the head of the Chinese CDC. And George told me the same. He had 27 cases of unspecified pneumonia that was not flu and it was not SARS. And that everyone, all 27, had come from the wet market in the town of Wuhan. And I asked George what his case definition was. And George said, Bob, it's individuals with an unspecified pneumonia that is not flu and is not SARS that came from the wet market. And I said, George, then by definition of your case definition, everybody had to come from the wet market. Why are you positioning the wet market as the source of this pandemic? You need to go outside the wet market and look for people with unspecified pneumonia that have nothing to do with the wet market. George called me back a couple days later, and he said, Bob, I went outside. We have hundreds of cases, and it had nothing to do with the wet market. So that's kind of important because you'll see that the scientific community and much of the international community very rapidly and I think non-discriminately latched on to the idea that the COVID pandemic had originated from the wet market. And I would argue that it really was a roost. Clearly, when we looked at the previous coronavirus outbreaks of SARS and MERS, they had a history of a bat going to an intermediate host. In the case of SARS, a civet cat. In the case of MERS, the camel, and then emerged as a human pathogen and caused cases. SARS in 2003, and then and MERS in 2012, 2013. But it's really important to note that both of those spillover infections in humans never learned how to efficiently infect humans. So as we sit here today, less than 10,000 cases in the world have occurred in the last 21 years from SARS. And yet MERS is very similar, less than 10,000 cases. And yet COVID, when it came into the human species, it was immediately one of the most infectious viruses in humans. I'm a human virologist, and I can say probably that COVID is the second most infectious virus for man, right behind measles. So although there was a scenario being developed, and I think intentionally, that this was like SARS and MERS and therefore was a spillover event, it really didn't make pathophysiological sense based on our history of how SARS and MERS came into humans and how COVID came in. And as a clinical virologist, it was one of the first things that raised my suspicion that there was an alternative hypothesis from spillover to the source of this pandemic, and that was a laboratory leak from gain-of-function research from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. And I obviously suggested at that time to Francis Collins and Tony Fauci, my counterparts at NIH, that we should aggressively investigate both hypotheses and try to determine what, if any, of the hypotheses we have any evidence for. And I will say, and we can talk about it in the questions, I was extremely disappointed in the lack of scientific principles that were followed, where we would have a rigorous scientific debate about the different hypotheses, when the scientific community rapidly in February 1st actually, coalesced around a single hypothesis that this had to come from spillover, and that individuals that would suggest that this may have come from a laboratory accident were somehow classified as conspiratorial. And it was disappointed that even the scientific literature got involved. The Lancet published a paper in February of that year, signed by a number of very prestigious scientists, over 20, that this came from spillover, period, and that anyone that would suggest that this could have emerged from a laboratory was conspiratorial. And I would argue all that approach was the antithesis of science. Science should encourage a rigorous debate of the different hypotheses. But it was unfortunate, and immediately I kind of got positioned as someone that wasn't going with the party line, which was that this was a spillover event. Despite the fact that over the months that passed, people looked in more than 80,000 different animals looking for some evidence of a natural reservoir, and have not been able to find it. And despite the fact, and it's only a matter of fact, that in 2014, this laboratory actually published a paper that showed they finally succeeded in teaching a coronavirus to infect humanized mice tissue through the H2 receptor, and had finally accomplished making coronaviruses in the laboratory through gain-of-function research, infect humanized mice. So that was sort of the scenario. It's also disappointing that there's been a number of scientific papers that have been published, most notable the proximal origin paper, which are really not factual, have not been retracted either by the journal or by the scientist. We now know that the COVID epidemic in Wuhan really probably started in August, September, October of 2019, and had really no start around the time that the proximal origin paper suggested that it occurred in the December, January of 2020 time force. And as a consequence of that, we can talk more about it. One of the things that has happened that has caused me a lot of pain, and my mom and dad were both NIH scientists, and I love science. I think it's a powerful tool that we have. But I do think that science has had an erosion of public trust because of the manner in which the scientific community has responded to investigating objectively the cause of the COVID pandemic. When we think about the next pandemic, when I went to CDC, I went with the thought, at the time I had 11 grandchildren, I went with the thought, the intuition that we were in for a respiratory pandemic. Now, I thought it was going to be a bird flu pandemic, and I thought it was not a bad idea to have a trained virologist running CDC when we were about to have a bird flu pandemic. I didn't anticipate it was going to be a coronavirus pandemic. But anyhow, I've always been concerned that as we sit here today, and as Claude's already alluded to, the COVID pandemic is really what I call the lesser pandemic. The great pandemic is coming, and it's going to be a bird flu pandemic, and we can talk more about it. Right now, we know that since 2019 in the United States, H5N1 has entered our chicken and turkey industry. We now have over 100 million infected birds in the United States. It's now migrated into over 27 different mammals in the U.S., including bears and cougars and dolphins and seals, and most recently, of course, dairy cattle, as you've read in the news. There's been limited ability of the bird flu to go from mammal to mammal. So it's gone from bird into a mammal, but then it doesn't go mammal to mammal. And it's gone bird into, say, dairy cows. And then there's been an occasional infection of humans, or birds to chickens and infection of humans, but it hasn't learned how to go to human. Because the species barrier for bird flu to go into humans, we know exactly what it is. It's 4 amino acids that have to change in very specific positions. Contrary to my recommendation in 2012, scientists in Europe and the United States had figured this out through gain-of-function research, and they actually published the exact 4 amino acids that have to be changed and where you have to change them. I was not in favor of that research being published because I was concerned that bioterrorism may take advantage of that and cause global chaos, but it has been published and it hasn't been used as bioterrorism yet. I happen to be a man of faith. I think it's sort of a miracle that hasn't happened. But the reality is we know the species barrier and how it has to change, and it hasn't done that. And those 4 amino acids is a pretty significant barrier. So there are many virologists that think the likelihood of spillover going to a pandemic from bird flu is much less likely. It could take hundreds of years, if ever. However, if one is now to go back to how COVID started and look at the possibility of gain-of-function research, where there's an intentional laboratory manipulation of the virus so that it now has been modified so it can now bind to human receptors, then that could be created quite easily. I'm of the point of view, and I did an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about 2 years ago, asking for a moratorium on gain-of-function research until there could be a broader public debate about the advantages of gain-of-function research. I didn't think this should be something just debated by scientists. I think the broader society should debate it. And if society feels we need to do this, then we have to figure out how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way, particularly with the priority on biocontainment. When I was CDC director, one of the difficult decisions I had to make was I actually shut down the U.S. military's biocontainment lab at Fort Detrick. And the reason I shut them down is in our inspections, they had violated some of the containment requirements. And when they were asked to correct them 4 weeks later, when we re-looked at them, they still weren't corrected, so we shut them down. And I will tell you that biocontainment is an enormous weakness. I'm sure that the biocontainment necessary at USC and my university and academic medicine around the United States and the world really isn't bulletproof. And I can tell you from experience that respiratory viruses, when they escape a laboratory, which they do, they can become quite problematic. When you look at bird flu, that H5N1 and H7N9 that have actually gone into humans where the human was infected by an animal, particularly those in Southeast Asia since, say, the beginning of the 2000s, it turns out of the human cases that have been reported, it's had about a 40% mortality. So it's not like COVID, which is maybe a 0.5% mortality. It can be quite fatal. The human cases we've had in the United States from chickens and dairy so far, the individuals that have been infected have not developed significant illness. But then that said, we're still talking about, less than a dozen infections. The final thing I'd just say is that as we sit here today, we really aren't prepared for the biosecurity concern. And we can talk more about it. I have my own views that I've laid out on how we can begin to get more prepared. I have the view that we should be building a private sector defense contractor like industry, similar to what we have for traditional defense through antiviral drug development, the diagnostics, PPE, medical devices we need in the case of a pandemic. We should be building that industry so that we'd be more prepared for when. I don't think it's a question of if, when this pandemic occurs. So Lance, I'll stop there and be happy to open any question or have you ask questions and see what's useful and which direction you'd like to take the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That was most interesting indeed. Let's talk first perhaps about the coming great pandemic which you see, and then we go back and talk about COVID-19 and all the many problems and controversies connected with that. Let me ask you, why do you really believe that a new pandemic is just round the corner? Because we clearly have, or we have to have learned something from COVID-19, how to be better prepared, how to make preparations by government and also by private institutions. So isn't it a little, let's say, dramatic to assume we just will have another even huger pandemic?
Yeah, I hate to say that I don't think we've learned a lot. We're no more prepared in terms of confronting a biological national security threat. We haven't invested in a meaningful way in the private sector for antiviral drug development, the platforms. We haven't developed in a meaningful way in expanded potential for vaccine development. We haven't really developed in a meaningful way in PPE diagnostics. So I would argue that we really haven't engaged the private sector. The reason Operation Warp Speed worked and we got COVID vaccines is there were a number of people that wanted the money to go to NIH and academic medicine to make the vaccines. There was a couple of us argued that it needed to go to the private sector and to get the private sector engaged. And luckily, Trump decided to engage the private sector. And as you know, within 8 months, we had developed a number of vaccines because that's what the private sector was capable to do. We need to do the same thing for antiviral drug development and broader issues. And we really haven't laid any of that groundwork at all. I mean, you look at the diagnostics, we were flat-footed when this pandemic happened. We were not able to meet the diagnostic requirements for COVID. And so for me, the other thing we haven't done and learned a lesson on this, and this is where the scientific community has played a big role, is they've, I think, refused to acknowledge the risk of gain-of-function research. I think it's sort of self-serving. They want to continue this research because it obviously is it's a significant amount of money. Academic medicine is very involved in this, but we have not tried to curtail gain-of-function research. We have not tried to really enhance our biosecurity to the level we do. So I would argue with you, Klaus, that we really aren't prepared. And you know, this is a recorded lecture, so students in the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, if and when the great pandemic comes, they can go back and look and say, hey, you know, there were some people that suggested we weren't prepared, because we're not prepared.
But whatever you say about the response to COVID-19 and the oftentimes quite chaotic response in all Western countries almost, the vaccine development was actually done quite efficiently and quite well. As you rightly said, within 8 months, I think the vaccine was on the market and many people benefited from it. Why would that not be different? Why would that be different with a new pandemic?
I think the vaccine was remarkable, and I was on the board of Operation Warp Speed. And I remember when the NIH leadership suggested that the money go to NIH, the $15 billion, and they develop a vaccine in 3 to 7 years. And the president said that that's not what he wanted. He wanted one by January 2021. And Debbie Birx and I were on the board, and we suggested that could be accomplished, but only if we engaged the private sector. And so what was done was after going through over 120 different vaccines, we selected 6 vaccines that we thought the companies had the ability to get over the goal line. And if they did, they could manufacture at least 100 million doses of the vaccine within that time frame. And that's where the Pfizers, the Modernas, actually AstraZeneca, J&J, Novavax, and a combination between GSK and Sophia Pasteur got the awards. And you are right that it was remarkable how fast we got those vaccines over the goal line. 3 of them before the end of the year, a 4th one right afterwards, and the 5th one in the early spring. So it was really a remarkable accomplishment by the private sector. I will say, as again a clinical virologist, the vaccines did something for us. That is, they preserved life because they could protect against hospitalization and death. But the vaccines that we developed for COVID do not prevent infection. So they did not have an impact on the kinetics of the epidemic. And as you may know, we're still losing about 150 people a day in the United States dying of COVID. It's still a major cause of death. We haven't eliminated. I would argue that what we really need to have in parallel, the vaccines have a certain limitation. While they save lives, they don't work that well. They don't prevent infection. They're non-durable. You probably have to get revaccinated if you're at risk for death from COVID, probably every 4 to 6 months. That they're just non-durable. What does work better is antiviral drug development, and we really haven't invested heavily in that. We have some, but we really don't have a large portfolio. So I'll be arguing that we need to invest much more heavily in antiviral drug development, platform technologies that can be used for all different types of pathogens. The reality is for flu in general, vaccines are, even the routine annual flu vaccine only works about 25 to 50% of the time. So I don't think vaccines are going to protect us against a pathogen that is likely to have a 5 to 20% mortality like bird flu will.
While vaccines were successfully developed, mistrust about vaccines and becoming vaccinations, which might lead to all sorts of illnesses, even death, increased almost parallel to the availability of vaccine. What went wrong? Because that was at least to that extent quite unusual. There have been flu and measles vaccinations for many years, and while there has been some concern or some skepticism, it wasn't as widespread as what we saw with the COVID-19 vaccines. What went wrong? And also, I would say maybe at the top of government, things went wrong. President Trump is well known for having expressed thorough skepticism about vaccines and has recommended all sorts of other remedies to fight COVID-19.
When I became CDC director, one of the things that was striking that first year was CDC announced more children died from flu than had ever died in the history of our nation. And so I looked into it, and I was shocked to find out when you look at flu vaccine, which we've had for a long time, less than 50% of the American public took the flu vaccine. And if you looked at it in African Americans, it was in the mid-30s, and in Hispanics, it was in the 20s. And so I took on vaccine hesitancy as a big issue. And I would say in my speeches that I felt that vaccines are the greatest gift of science to modern medicine. We ought to embrace them. And it really frustrated me that so many of the American public leaves them on the shelf. And so I went and tried to work through the African American press, the Hispanic press, to try to get it up. And I did get the African American community up into the mid-40s and Hispanics in the mid-30s before I left. But the reality is still over half the American public didn't take the flu vaccine. When we had the measles outbreaks in the United States, you probably remember in New York, in New Rochelle, some of the Orthodox Jewish community. We also had it out in Washington and Oregon. I was shocked as I went through some of our schools to find that we had some schools in some of our states that less than 25% of the children were vaccinated. So there was a large sentiment about vaccines. But then I argued one of the things that I think really hurt, and you bring it up, and I think it's something we're going to have to fight to get around. I think it was a big mistake for the government to become heavy-handed and mandate vaccines against people that didn't want to take vaccines, particularly for a vaccine that didn't protect against infection. And I suggested if you tell people they have to take something that they don't want to take, you're just going to make them more hesitant, more resistant, and increase the anti-vax hesitancy even worse. It would be better for the healthcare profession to recommend the vaccines, explain to why they should be used, and then if the patient chooses not to take it, next time they see them, explain again why they think it would be their interest to take it. So I do think there was a big mistake in mandating vaccines, negating the value of natural immunity from natural infection. And I do agree with you. I think the climate that's in the general public against vaccines now is much greater than when I became CDC director in 2018. And I think it's largely because of the way the COVID vaccines were positioned on the American public.
Have you learned from that? So if there were a new pandemic, would there be less vaccine hesitancy?
Well, I think again, what I would recommend if I'm in making recommendations is that we don't mandate vaccines unless they prevent infection. If we have a vaccine that really can stop the infection so it can't happen, we can argue about mandating. But other than that, I think we have to really empower people to make their own choice. And try to take the time to explain to them why we find the vaccine to be of benefit and why we think they should take it. But to answer you very honestly, I suspect that vaccine hesitancy is going to be a real problem for us for the near future.
How do you explain that? Has that got something to do with other forces in society? Has it got to do something with how government reacts, or how do you explain it?
I think it's a loss of institutional credibility, and it's very disappointing. As I mentioned to you, I think the scientific community has lost credibility over their lack of openness to debate about origins of COVID. I think the CDC has lost credibility in terms of some of the mandates that they put out. Obviously, I think the closing of the economy was a big mistake. Shutting the schools was a big mistake. I think the vaccine mandates were a big mistake. And I think a lot of society doesn't give these institutions a second chance when they make big mistakes like that. Hopefully, and I do think, we haven't necessarily been honest and transparent about vaccines. I'm a big advocate of vaccines. I've had 8 COVID vaccines myself to date, since I told you it's non-durable. So I get vaccinated about every 6 months. But that doesn't mean that society is going to change their point of view. I don't think we've been as open and transparent about the side effects from the vaccine. In my clinic, I have a number of patients that have not had COVID, but have gotten quite sick and debilitated from the mRNA vaccines. And there's been, I think, less openness about recognizing that some of these vaccines, although rare, do have significant side effects. And a lot of these patients have really been denied credibility when in fact they really have been injured from the vaccines. So this is what I mean about honesty and transparency. I'm a big advocate for vaccines and will continue to push. I think they're really important, but I think it's important that we're honest about the vaccines. I think it's important we don't mandate the vaccines.
Is the situation unique in the United States, or is it similar all over the world as far as you know?
Klaus, I don't know. I mean, it's clear that there are certain countries that have probably higher vaccine hesitancies than us, and there are other countries that have much less vaccine hesitancy. I don't know about you. If you're in Germany, I would think Germany would be much less vaccine hesitancy, but I don't know.
There's quite, as far as I know, and I don't have any percentage numbers, there's quite a high degree of vaccine hesitancy as well, I think. And it has something to do, as you rightly said, with the lack of trust in institutions, which has increased over time, I would say. You mentioned in your talk, you kind of scared us really by saying there will be a major great pandemic, as you called it, in the near future, or certainly within 10 to 20 years. Again, why do you have that confidence that there will be such a pandemic?
Well, it's because, unfortunately, this is where Tony Fauci and I have disagreed when he said the only possibility for the COVID is it came from spillover. It came from bats to some unknown animal. And that's the only way it could have happened. Because prior to 2010, 2012, that's the only way it could have happened. We didn't have gain-of-function research. We didn't have people in the laboratory intentionally trying to teach these pathogens how to infect humans. I'm disappointed to tell you that recently in that one of the laboratories that originally was funded to teach the bird flu how to infect humans and was put on moratorium in 2014. Recently, the moratorium was lifted, so they now have been approved to go back and learn how to teach the flu virus how to infect human tissue. And I think there are other scientists that are doing this as we speak.
In the United States, or where?
In the United States and in other parts of the world. And I do think the scientific community is not trying to cause a pandemic, but I do think they're arrogant about their ability to keep a respiratory pathogen from basically contained. And it's that scientific arrogance, which I think when you look at COVID, I'm saying it evolved from scientific experiments in a laboratory that was intentional, that was trying to do, I think, good things. They were trying to make probably a vaccine vector for good purposes, but the bottom line is escaped. And at the end of the day, over 20 million people died. All right. Now we have nature trying to change, and it will continue to try to change, although the species barrier for amino acids is pretty high. If it's up to just nature, it could take a long time. But if there's scientists that think we need to do this, and there's a lot of very committed scientists that think they need to do this gain of function research to help protect humanity against these pathogens when they emerge, but they don't consider the fact that they may be emerging them, like we did with COVID. So that's where I am. I mean, I hope to God I'm wrong. I have 14 grandchildren. I'd rather them not have to live through a great pandemic that has a huge mortality. I tell people, your students, to read the book The Great Influenza by John Barry. If you want to see the power of flu, it will tell you the power of flu going through the 1918 epidemic, when basically there was heaps of bodies in front of all the fire stations, in our country, because so many people were dying. I think we have to realize we're at risk for this, what I call the great pandemic. And part of the reason I stress it, Klaus, is I want us to get prepared. I want us to have the tools to confront it. I want us to have the countermeasures. I want us, when I was CDC director, I feared this thing, and I thought I'd go down there, and for the first 2 years, I'd just do a body count. When the respiratory pandemic came, I was so thankful for the mRNA technology, because rather than wait 18 months to 2 years for a vaccine, now I could have one in weeks that could impact mortality, and which were developed within 8 months, as you commented. And we really saved a lot of lives from that vaccine and those vaccines. We have that same technology that we can bring to bear to new pathogens if we can figure it out. But we should also have the same technology, the platform technology, for antiviral drug development. So I'd like to be wrong, but I am trying to motivate people to get prepared, not to be complacent, not to think that this couldn't happen. And I want them to first recognize, and this is very frustrating for me, and this is where the scientific community, I think, has made a big mistake, is where they tried to, in my view, hide that it already did happen. COVID was a consequence of science, okay? Science gone wrong. So let's not make the same mistake again.
Thank you. Let's go back to COVID-19 and the beginning of COVID-19. As you know, there are two major theories. One theory, which you referred to in your talk, right at the beginning, it was assumed the virus got out from a wet market, an animal market in Wuhan. And the other theory is that it escaped in a lab, accidentally escaped, not intentionally. But these two theories seem to dominate the talk of the town and have led to quite a few controversies. And of course, Chinese-American relations have also been poisoned because of these theories about the lab escape. How do we know what actually is more likely to have happened than not? Why do you discount the escape from the wet market, from the animal market in Wuhan?
Well, the first reason is that's not when the pandemic started. We now know the pandemic started in August or September of 1919, so it had nothing to do with the wet market. The second reason I told you that the wet market scenario was created by George's case definition, where he included, in order to be included, you had to be from the wet market. And when he went out the following days outside the wet market, he found that it had nothing to do with the wet market. So the CDC director of China will also tell you it had nothing to do with the wet market.
So why do a lot of scientists, a lot of people still adhere to that theory if it's that clear?
I think it's because they've made I hate to use the word, a conspiracy, but a conspiracy, not, the conspiracy was to protect gain-of-function research. They wanted to turn the attention away from the laboratory and the gain-of-function research. When you look at this virus, first, and the second thing I can tell you, the Chinese government and others have worked very hard to find a intermediate host. And as I said, over 80,000 animals, they've looked in many species, they found no intermediate host. We found an intermediate host for SARS and MERS all within the first 6 months. We haven't found the intermediate host. We have found publications from the laboratory where they showed that they actually taught coronaviruses to infect humanized tissue, all right? And we also have found a grant that they wrote that talked about what they wanted to do, which was to take the coronavirus and to insert what we call a furin cleavage site in order for it to gain tropism for humans. Now, that grant was not funded by DARPA, but you and those in academic know that doesn't necessarily mean that the research wasn't done. When you look at COVID-19, we now know it has a furin cleavage site. And contrary to what some of the scientists have said, where they say coronaviruses can have a furin cleavage site, not this class of coronaviruses. There's no such thing as a furin cleavage site. This is the only one there. And when you look at the furin cleavage site, it changes the orientation of the binding receptor for the bat binding receptor to the bat receptor and the human receptor, so that it's very ironic that right now for me, that when you look at SARS and MERS, those viruses, even though they've been in humans, still infect bats. When you look at COVID-19 now with the furin cleavage site, it no longer efficiently infects bats, but it highly efficiently infects humans. When you look at the amino acid sequence that's in the furin cleavage site, there's 12 nucleotides. There's the nucleotides that are for arginine are part of that 12 nucleotide sequence. And you remember from your chemistry or biology that each amino acid has 3 nucleotides that codes for it. It turns out that the preferential triplet for nucleotides that are used for arginine in that furin cleavage site is the preferential triplets that's used for humans, not the preferential triplet used for bats. So highly suggestive that this was manipulated. There's also evidence that the interferon response element was knocked out. There's also evidence that there was some changes in the immunodominant domain to be able to respond by the human tissue. So there's at least 4 signature changes in this virus that are highly inconsistent with natural evolution. Again, and if you look at some of the great virologists at Livermore and Department of Energy, they've articulated all of this. But the scientific community, and this is what done when Fauci and everyone had that meeting in February 1st, where they started thinking it might be from the laboratory, but within 3 days, they all voted that it had to come from nature. And then they did the Lancet article that Jerry Mafrar orchestrated, that everyone said it had to come from nature, and anyone thought it came from the laboratory was a conspirator. And then they did the proximal origin paper that said it had to come from the wet market, even knowing that the epidemic started 4 months earlier. All of that, I think, is highly, highly suspect. And I don't have any doubt in my mind. I can't go into everything. Hopefully Biden will declassify the rest of the information. He hasn't, even though Congress requested it be declassified unanimously, both the House and unanimously and Senate. They still haven't declassified it. I have to be careful because I've read all the classified information, so I'm aware of it. My colleague, John Radcliffe, who was in charge of our Defense Intelligence Agency, he's read it all. You were at the Heritage Foundation group where we had our view on it. We didn't do that report to talk about origin. That wasn't the purpose. It was more about accountability. But the fact is, I think there's unfortunately no doubt that this evolved through gain-of-function research. And I think the fact that the scientific community hasn't been more objective has really hurt them. I mean, they may think it helped them, but I think it's really hurt them, where they've sort of went out with a narrative on February 1st and they haven't changed. And you asked the question why. I think the answer to why is to protect gain-of-function research. The scientific community does not want gain-of-function research regulated. They want to be able to do the gain-of-function research on their terms because they do believe ultimately there's benefit to the humankind. That's why they want to do it. But there's also a lot of self-interest involved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you have no real evidence, just factors which count against the wet market and factors which seem to indicate it comes out of a lab. But what we really need is the paper trail, which at the moment remains classified. Is that essentially?
Yeah, I would say, Claudia, you may find that there are whistleblowers from the Chinese.
We just had a screen freeze. You said there are Chinese whistleblowers, and I didn't quite get what you said afterward.
I said, there may be Chinese whistleblowers that have more direct information. You know also the reports that the original cases in November in Wuhan, the original cases were the first 3 patients that were reported were all scientists that were working in that laboratory. So there's a lot of information, but I think you're going to have to look at it more like a jury trial, and you're going to have to look at where the preponderance of evidence is. And where does it come down? I'm going to argue as a clinical virologist in 2024, the predominant of evidence is that it's laboratory origin. In January of 2020, it was a flip of the coin. We hadn't looked for the intermediate. But now in 2025 or 2024, I think the predominant evidence is that this virus, and ultimately what may happen, what I believe is going to happen, and you may know more because of your background, I believe the Chinese government eventually is going to tell the story accurately.
Why, first of all, why do you think that they will do that? And secondly, why have Chinese-American relations been so poisoned by this issue? Couldn't scientists collaborate without any side losing face?
I don't know the answer to that. I actually think it's more anti-China. My colleagues that say this virus came from the dirty practices of how the Chinese collect their food. I think that's more anti-China than saying that this was a laboratory accident that involved U.S. investigators, including your own university, University-Chapel Hill. Barrett's group was very involved in this research. And where the Chinese made the mistake, in my view, is the Chinese made the mistake that they didn't follow the international health regulations. When I wanted to go into China the first week of China, per the international health regulations, and work out and understand whether there was asymptomatic transmission, was there human-to-human transmission, the American CDC was blocked from going in. And that was direct violation of the international health regulations. WHO initially was blocked. So that's where China's responsibility is. They didn't follow the international health regulation, which they're a signator. Their blame is not the lab accident, if it was a lab accident, like I believe, because that laboratory work was not unique to China. The United States was very involved in it, both with collaborators and both by funding mechanisms.
I still don't understand why then both sides cannot agree on a common process to investigate the issue.
I can't either. It's obviously political. I mean, I was in the room where I asked President Trump to call President Xi in the first days of January. I was in the room when they had the conversation. It was to let the U.S. CDC come in and provide support to help get a better understanding of this new epidemic, was because the Chinese CDC said there's no human-to-human transmission, there's no asymptomatic infection. Well, both incorrect, extensive interest to come in. The whole thing was abnormal because normally George Gao, when I talked to him, I said, invite me in. I have a team of 20 people, 25 people ready to come in to help you. And normally I would just do it. But George said, Bob, I can't invite you in. I have to get approval from my chain of command, meaning the Minister of Health and ultimately the President of China. And that never happened. So they did violate the international health regulation. It does show you, when you look at biosecurity, one of the real weaknesses that we have. We have an international health regulation that's totally non-enforceable. If a country doesn't want to abide by it, there's absolutely nothing the WHO can do to tell them to abide by it. And that's where I've argued we need an enforceable international health regulation at a time where bioterrorism is such a potential threat. Because a mistake in a laboratory in the Ukraine could cause a global pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you. You were there during a very tumultuous period of time in US and global history. It wasn't just the pandemic, though it was terrible enough. We had 7 million people who died worldwide, 1.2 million people who died in the United States, not counting all the very many seriously ill and ill people who needed hospital care. We had many international events which were rather tumultuous. For example, very difficult American-Chinese relations, but also American-European relations were pretty bad at that time. What was it like to be in the middle of all that happening? What was it like to deal with the Trump administration at the time? I read somewhere that at some point President Trump called you confused, which of course you rejected, but it cannot have been very easy for you.
Well, I enjoyed actually my time working with Trump because I started every comment with him the same. I said, Mr. President, remember my role. My role is to tell you what I think you need to hear, not what you want to hear. So you need to get prepared because you're going to hear things from me you don't want to hear. And he really allowed me to say what I want. When he talked about me being confused, it's when I suggested that protective mechanisms like distance and masking may be more effective than the vaccine for some people that didn't respond to the vaccine. So if I give you a vaccine and you don't respond to it, then I would argue that the vaccine didn't do anything for you. You should still social distance and do a vaccine. He didn't quite understand what I said. We talked afterwards. I explained to him, and he said, well, if that's what you said, then it's correct. But he didn't, on national television, did tell people I was confused. I did find him, and I've worked and spoken to many presidents in my career. I did find one thing that I did enjoy about working with him. He actually read everything I gave him. I can tell you I'd worked with other presidents that gave it to their staff, and their staff read it. And so when we were briefing, the staff was answering the questions. He did actually read the documents. He was very decisive when I wanted to shut down air travel to China on January 31st. He listened to my arguments, and within 10 minutes, he shut down air travel to China. So I found that now, I don't like escalation. I don't like name calling. I didn't think it helped, some of the comments that were made. I do agree with you. It would have been a much better scenario if we had partnered with China from the very beginning. President Xi and President Trump partnered to get to the bottom of this for the best interest of the world. Unfortunately, that's not what happened.
But you just said, isn't the reputation Trump has? Apparently he doesn't read things, and you just say the opposite. Were you accepted in the room?
No, he definitely read, and he definitely was very informed. Nothing like what the media tries to present him as at all. I will say you have to be careful, because if you tell him something or write something that turns out not to be accurate, and then you want to redact it and have him now correct it, he frequently remembers the first time you told him it did, but for the next week, every time he was asked, he would still do the original briefing. So he does have a memory that he sort of latches on to what he learned. But he was to me, of all the people I've dealt with at that level, he read everything, he understood it, he knew it, he had thought about it, he was decisive. Nothing like the media portrayed him to be, but I guess that's their agenda in their own way.
You also worked for President George W. Bush, I understand. What was the difference?
Yes, yeah.
What was the difference between Trump and Bush in working style and approach to problems?
I liked Bush a lot. I mean, he's a good human being. He treats people with, well. He doesn't push. He's not a pushy type person. But I will say the difficulty with Bush, in my view, is he wasn't decisive, wouldn't make the decision, would then go, talk with a bunch of other people for a day or two or three or a week, and then they might make a decision, and then in 2 weeks they may remake the decision. Well, with Trump, the decision was made. I mean, when I told him that he had to shut down all air travel to China in December 31st, we had the Treasury Secretary was in the room, Mick Mulvaney was in the room. He asked me to make my argument. Mike Pence was in the room. I made my argument, and literally within 10 minutes, he turned to Mulvaney and said, "We're shutting down all air travel to China." And of course, Mnuchin was not happy because he thought it was going to be economic a real problem. And when I went in March and said that we need to shut down all air travel to and from Europe, he listened to my arguments. Mnuchin told him that he can't do it. It will cause a Great Depression we'll never get out of, even if he wins a second term. He listened to my arguments again. And at the end of the arguments, this was a little longer, but maybe within 15, 20 minutes, he turned to the chief of staff at the time and said, if the CDC director says we need to shut down all air travel to and from Europe, shut it down. Very decisive. He didn't get on the phone. He didn't call up so-and-so and ask so-and-so what they thought, didn't call the ambassador to Germany or, the UN. He made the decision. And I kind of liked that decisiveness.
So he didn't really consult his staff and his experts.
Well, the expert that he consulted was the ones he had in the room at the time. Mm-hmm. For the public health policy, it was me and the Treasury Department secretary. Mm-hmm. And I think Fauci was in the room too, by the way. And Debbie Birx, who is the head of the coronavirus task force, was in the room. And so was Mike Pence was in the room.
It is often said that Trump lost his re-election bid because of the pandemic and because what was perceived as a chaotic response to the pandemic and the rapid increase in numbers of deaths in the United States. Would you go along with that or not?
I think there are people that believe that. I mean, the reason the United States had the death rates that they had, which were significant, you mentioned 1.2 million people, compared, say, to Taiwan, it was less than 5,000 people. And the reason for that was unfortunately, and this is something I'm working on now, is that America is unhealthy. We have over 50% or 40% of the American public over the age of 30 has a chronic disease. Over 30% are obese. All right. We have type 2 diabetes. We have hypertension. All right. And the fact is, COVID learned how to exploit those diseases. It's a blood vessel disease. It's not a lung disease. And if you were older and your blood vessels were less resilient, you were more likely to have a bad outcome. I know President Trump said to me one day, "Bob, these people didn't die of COVID, they died of a heart attack." I said, "No, Mr. President, they died of a heart attack from microcoagulation because they had COVID. COVID causes the microthrombi." We had a high death rate because we're a sick nation. And one of the things I'm hoping that we can do in the last 10, 15, 20 years of my life is help agitate, not only for biosecurity, which I believe in for my grandkids, but I also believe in agitating a transformational, disruptive approach to healthcare to bring a health system into the system as opposed to the disease system that we have by really going after chronic disease and really going after continuous monitoring of chronic disease to help people manage their chronic disease more effectively and on the early end prevent chronic disease. But that's why we died. We're a sick nation. And I mentioned to you already, we're still losing about 150 people a day in the United States. But the people that are dying are over the age of 60. They have hypertension or type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, or they're obese. Those are the people that are dying.
Thank you. Before we open it up to some questions, let me ask you, do you expect that in the future biology and viruses and similar weapons or will be similar issues will be weaponized, and like cybersecurity, the country and perhaps the Western world will be under attack from biological weapons in warfare? Is that what we can expect?
I don't think we'll see it in state-sponsored warfare. I do think we're at risk for bioterrorism because it's simpler, it's cheaper, it's easier. And it can be bioterrorism that's true terrorism as opposed to causing massive death. I always said when I had 3 Ebola outbreaks during my time as CDC director. 3 Ebola outbreaks in my time as CDC director. The second one was a huge outbreak in the DRC in a war zone. And there was treatment centers where there was a lot of ISIS and a lot of terrorists around. And it would have been very easy to go into any of those treatment centers as a volunteer and collect contaminated body fluids and be able to put them into guinea pigs. And then you would have a source of Ebola. And I could, take 20 people that wanted to be martyr killers. And rather than strap a bomb to them, I could just inject them with Ebola and then send them to Berlin and to Paris and to London and New York and Washington and give them some money to get on the subways and let them ride them until they dropped dead. And there'd be panic. There was panic when we had the one case in New York that went outside the hospital. So I think terrorism it can happen, but I think it's much more likely, since I believe in the power of science. I think it's much more likely in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years that you're going to see viruses become really a backbone of new medicine and new therapeutic advances to cure disease. They're going to be the good guys, not the bad guys. I'm more worried, about the bioterrorism from the scientific arrogance, where we have a mistake in the laboratory. I'm more worried about a atomic explosion in the atmosphere that knocks out all the digital machines in our world, and we end up, with all of our refrigerators and all of our electrical grids go down. But I don't think we're going to see state-sponsored bioterrorism through viruses. We went through that in the 60s and 70s. I don't think that. But I do think we can see isolated bioterrorism from radical groups that want to cause havoc. Yeah, I can see that. Mm-hmm. And I do think I think it's more likely we'll see accidental consequences of scientific arrogance that will cause us biological difficulty.
Mm-hmm. You see scientific cooperation between, let's say, the United States and China for achieving these positive results, which you just mentioned? Or will it be like what we see at the moment politically and economically, that we ever more drift into different worlds? The famous world is decoupling. Are we going to see that in scientific research as well, or will that be an exception to the rule?
Well, I would argue that we have to partner with China for health. There's no way that we can make America healthy again and not partner with China for health. You realize that our active pharmaceutical ingredients, they're made in China, right? Some in India, but now India is getting mostly, half of theirs from China also. China, it has the capacity to make most of the active pharmaceutical ingredients we need. We have over 330 medicines that are currently short in the United States. I have been trying to raise, some people want to help. I'm looking for $25 million because I wanted to purchase a facility with a partner of mine in Hunan Island And the whole purpose of that facility was to be able to bring in different biosimilars that I need from the Chinese manufacturers that I can quality control, so we can bring them in to help target global shortages, U.S. shortages for pharmaceuticals. China's got to be our partner in biomedical, in the biomedical future, at least for the next decade, because we don't have the ability to not have a functional relationship with them for pharmaceuticals. And so we have to look at that. How do we build that partnership up? We can disagree on sharing, airplane technology, but we need to partner in biotechnology.
Mm-hmm. What about the Europeans? There is, of course, the close transatlantic relationship, but regarding, for example, vaccine development, there's also an awful lot of competition rather than cooperation. What is the future?
Well, I think that probably cooperation is, in my sense, if you look at the big vaccine companies and you look at the leaders in immunology, human immunology, as someone that's done this in America now since the 70s, there's no question one of the reasons I spent so much time with my European colleagues, they're way ahead of us when it comes to the immunology of the human body. The real scientific power is we would say across the pond. Okay. And I would have a lot of faith in the scientific power in both England, Germany, France, Switzerland when it comes to human immunology. And they just don't have the active pharmaceutical ingredient reservoir either. They're dependent on China and India. We're dependent on China and India. So, I do think we need to have, I've argued for this for, since who was president, probably way before Bush. I argued I wanted a partnership between the United States and China I wanted to get antivirals to most of the world when they were very expensive. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if the United States and China worked together to bring life-saving medicines to the world? And do that together. I was never able to get that over the goal line. I wrote some significant white papers for the State Department to try to get it over the goal line. It never got any traction. That's when we had a better relationship, I guess, with China. But my hope is that we'll see what China needs of America. I think they would like some of our agricultural support. And I think what we want from them is we need their pharmaceutical active ingredient support, and let's figure out how to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. Just off topic a little bit, one of the problems with the United States and its medical sector is, of course, that it costs an awful lot, both treatment and surgeries and pharmaceutical medicine. What do we do about that? I think the United States compares very unfavorably in terms of costs with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. I think, as I talked to you, when you just look at pharmaceuticals, one of the areas there is to go after the idea of bringing biosimilars into the marketplace, to meet the public good. I happen to be on, one of the injectables for diabetes, and I spend about $600 a shot for me to do that. Now, luckily, my insurance covers most of it. But that same pharmaceutical, if I had my unit in Wuhan Island, I had already lined up to get at least 100 million doses initially that I could distribute, and I was going to be able to sell it for about $10 a dose, and still make a decent profit. All right. So there's such an artificial inflation of cost. Now you have to be careful. Some of this is related to, recovery and research costs, but a lot of stuff in America is these middlemen that are jacking up the price. I have drugs that I prescribe for my patients right now, long COVID, which is a real problem. And that drug can cost anywhere from $200 to $2,000, depending on what pharmacy they pick it up at. Well, that shouldn't be allowed. That should be illegal. All right. So I think we really do have to get better control on pricing. This is why I would say we got to move to a chronic disease continuous management system and move away from an acute disease system. we have to, I just had surgery for prostate cancer, and it was like $30,000. That's just we've got to bring healthcare costs under control. We've got to be transparent. Patients have to know what the cost is. They have to be able to compare costs to other people. But you're right, our health system right now, the incentives are largely still aligned with treating disease. And the system makes money provided you get sick. I want the system to make money provided you stay healthy. And it's going to be very disruptive. It's something I'm working on right now with Bobby Kennedy and obviously President Trump on Make America Healthy Again. But I think, it doesn't help to have healthcare that nobody can afford. Mm-hmm. And I know, just as an aside, one of my 6 children almost died from a fentanyl overdose that he had taken cocaine. And he's a musician, and the musicians use cocaine. He used cocaine. It was contaminated with fentanyl. He almost died. And then eventually he took his dad's advice to go into a treatment program to get off cocaine. And but in order for me to get him in a program, it cost me $35,000 a month. And he was in treatment for 14 months, so you can add that up. That's a lot of money. But I will say my son's now in his 8th year of recovery, and he's alive, and he almost died 8 years ago. There's a lot of people that are struggling with drug use disorder in our country, and there's a lot of people that have unmet mental health needs, and they're not getting them done. And we need to figure out how to provide that care and treatment for people for treatment for drug treatment disorder. And we need to get people into care that they need for mental health services. This is part of what trying to work on with Kennedy. It doesn't help our nation by keeping these people out of care. And they're not in care because they can't afford it. I sold my beach house. That was my wife's and my dream house. We sold it because that's the only way we could afford to get our son the care he needs.
That clearly shouldn't be the case. I think we all agree with you that costs should be brought down significantly. Thank you for that. Let's open up to questions from the online audience. Can I ask Katie to ask the first question, please?
Absolutely. So the first question we have is one from Larry, who asks, why do you feel that our faith or regard for real experts has collapsed in recent years? And can you detail those reasons?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is, I'll give you an example of one of the debates I had with one of my colleagues that was making the argument that natural immunity would lead to herd immunity and this pandemic would sort of die out. And he initially said it was 30% and then we'd die out. And I actually told the president that and other people. And then later, a little later, he said it was 50%. And then a little later, he said 70%. And then a reporter said, but so-and-so, just 3 months ago, you said 50%. Why did you change? What new data did you have to now tell it has to be 70%? And he said with a straight face, I don't have any new data. I told you 50% because I didn't think you were prepared to hear 70%. So when you ask me the question, I think if people try to just not tell the truth, they try to package their answer in a way they think you want to hear it, they're going to lose credibility, and they're going to lose it fast. And I think, unfortunately, that happened. Whether it was an argument about whether masks work or don't work, whether it was an argument about herd immunity one way or the other, There were people that were very definitive about positions that weren't actually truthful. And I remember when I became CDC director, the old guard that was there sat me down to explain to me that I had to be very careful about what I said, because it took many years for CDC to gain the credibility that they had in public health. And it could lose it in a single interview if you're not careful. And so, the better answer, if you don't know the answer, is to say, which is what I said a lot, actually, I don't know the answer. I'll get back to you. I didn't make up an answer that I thought you wanted to hear. So I think it's that lack of the sense that some of the leaders just weren't honest, truthfully honest, and say, I don't know the answer. I don't know what to do. This is my best guess. I think there are a lot of people that were way too definitive with answers that weren't factually correct.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Emmeline, can you ask the next question?
Yes. Albert would like to know, do you think there is any chance that the virus leaking from the lab was in some way intentional on China's part?
I personally do not think it was intentional. I don't know this to be true, what I'm about to say. It's the way I've put it together. And I have shared my point of view at the highest levels of our government. I think this was very intentional research. All right. It was not accidental research. It was intentional research. And the intent, in my view, was public good. The Chinese researchers were working on trying to create a vaccine vector which could be used to vaccinate the Chinese military and the Chinese people, and then maybe the rest of the world. And in order for it to be a useful vector, first and foremost, it had to be an aerosolized vector. It couldn't be an injectable. It wasn't going to really do the job if you had to constantly use needles and inject. The second thing it had to do is not make people sick. So it had to be asymptomatic. And therefore, that's why I think the interferon response element was knocked out. And the third thing it had to do is it had to be able to be given multiple times to a human being. So a human couldn't develop an immune response that was definitively immune so that the virus could never replicate again as a vector. And so that's why I think the immunodominant response element was also changed. So I believe as a virologist, this was a highly engineered virus for a purpose. And that purpose was to make a vaccine vector that you could insert any antigen you wanted to, and you could vaccinate a population for public good. So I think it was a public good effort. But I think that the problem was, and there are documents that have been declassified and some still in the classified space, which document very well that this laboratory was doing these experiments. The declassified ones document very well that these experiments on this highly contagious respiratory virus were actually being done in P2 conditions, which would be inconsistent with containment.
Thank you. Katie, can you read out the next question, please?
Yes. So Scott Schwartz is wondering about the association of the impact of global warming, and asks more specifically whether or not you are worried about the melting of permafrost and the release of dangerous ancient viruses or bacteria due to this.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I think it is potentially a biological threat. You've seen some of the evidence already that these old viruses have come back from, say, the 1918 epidemic, and they're actually there, and they're infectious, and they're still alive. So I don't quite know why all the dinosaurs died. But I assume it was climate, but if it was infectious, I do think there could be pathogens in the permafrost, and people should just be aware of it and keep surveillance up.
And they would survive in the permafrost?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. You would believe they wouldn't, but they actually brought back the 1918 virus. They found that, and they found some other smallpox stuff in bones.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Emmeline, please. Mhm.
We have a couple of people wondering about kind of your insights on Donald Trump. And so, more specifically, after expending so much money on getting COVID research started and then successfully getting vaccines in very quick time, why didn't Trump take credit for doing so?
I'm not saying I don't know. He doesn't run away from the fact. I give him, I mean, I was in the room when we had these debates. I was on the board. If it wasn't for his decision, we wouldn't have gotten these vaccines in the time we did. And the most important decision, which many people may not appreciate, once we went through the 120 vaccines that were in development and kind of looked through which ones we thought the companies developed them had the muscle, the capacity to make at least 100 million doses for the public by January. So that means they had to have a certain capacity in manufacturing, et cetera. And we picked Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca, J&J, all fairly big companies. And then we picked Novavax, which was a smaller new company, had a protein vaccine, which I like a lot. And then there was a consortium between Sophie Pasteur and GSK, both European vaccine companies. Those were the 6 companies that we selected. And they all had phase 1 data that warranted they were ready to go into phase 2 studies. But the most important thing that happened that May was that, and this was Trump's decision, because none of the scientists came up with it. The Trump's decision was that in order for this to be available, because normally what would happen, the FDA would approve the product, and then the company would then go build the capacity to manufacture it, and then 6 months, a year, 2 years later, we would have the manufactured product. It's a matter of fact that when the FDA approved the original vaccines, I think December 10th, I had those vaccines shipped to every state in the United States the following day, meaning we already had them produced. And what Trump decided, it was his decision that the United States, I think it was in July, the United States bought $2 billion of each of the 6 vaccines before we even knew if they worked. And so we may have had a lot of paperweights, but the idea is by buying them at that time, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J could build the manufacturing capability so that when their phase 3 trial was finished, they had already the 100 million doses in the bank to distribute to the American public, and they did. And that was a business decision that was made by Trump himself. And I think really one of the most important decisions that was made, because had he not made that decision, we would have known we had vaccines that worked, and then you would wait another year before you got them. But I don't think he was really about, I mean, he's not against getting credit for it, but it's just, I don't see him, I never saw him try to tell people he wanted credit for it in all the interactions I had with him. Although I do believe he should get credit for the fact that we had the vaccines available by 2021. When I left office in January 20th, this is where I get a little upset when the Biden group came in. When I left office, we were vaccinating 1 million people a day, which is remarkable within 8 months of when we started. And I was a little upset with Biden's chief of staff, McClain, because he said that I handed him a mess, and that within a month or two, he'd be up to 1 million a day. And I wanted to say, but wait, we're already at 1 million a day. I want you to thank us for the football we gave you, and now you take it to 2 million a day. But I think Trump deserves a lot of credit, but he's never tried to get credit for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that would be quite unusual for any politician not to try to get credit, as much credit as they can.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why. I give him credit when I speak because people don't realize if it wasn't for his business decision to invest the $2 billion in each company in June, July of the summer, the vaccine would not have been available probably until, 6 or 12 months later.
Mm-hmm. Right, let's have another question. Emmeline, please.
If people have more questions, please submit them. I was wondering, at the beginning of your tenure as CDC director, you talked about, before COVID, you talked about the opioid epidemic as the largest health problem in the United States. And since you started as the CDC director and since you left office, the National Opioid Settlement Funds have started being spent across the United States. How do you think those funds should best be spent to combat the epidemic?
I don't really know the right answer to that. I will say that we need an enormous investment in treatment for drug use disorder. We need an enormous investment. A lot of the people, including my son, who got into cocaine, he kind of got into cocaine and alcohol because he was self-medicating because his behavioral medical issue wasn't being addressed. If it had been addressed, he wouldn't have had to self-medicate. So he used cocaine and alcohol to self-medicate from his mood swing disorder. I'm obviously very disappointed about the role that the medical community played in the opioid epidemic. There's no doubt about the prescription drug use that physicians did. One of the things I did as CDC director was really try to change it so that orthopedics didn't use opioids when someone sprained an ankle or broke a bone. We used non-steroidals, or dentists. We got to get the dentists and the oral surgeons not to put people on opioids. You don't realize that a single prescription for an opioid, like if you got a Percocet for a broken leg, for a week or two, you have a 3 to 5% chance of becoming addicted. So I would try to teach doctors that one of the most significant decisions you make is to prescribe narcotics. You could be creating a lifetime chronic illness in that individual. As a physician, I can say I've probably prescribed less than 5 narcotic prescriptions in my entire life. I never was a big thing. And then when medicine got into what they call the 6th vital sign, when they wanted everyone to have a pain score, when you were in the hospital, what's your pain score? And everyone had to treat pain. The medical community contributed a lot to the opioid addiction clientele in between 2000 and 2010. And it's disappointing to me as a provider, a doctor, that we played that role. Clearly now it made a lot of improvements. I started a program, a prescription notification program, so that doctors in cross state lines would know that you got a prescription from another doctor in another state, and then your prescription would be held. I also got it so that your prescription was not written for a month worth of Percocet, but you get 3 days worth of Percocet. And then you had to come in. There was a pharmacy in West Virginia, just to show you how bad it was. It was a town of less than 3,000 people. That pharmacy had filled 20 million prescriptions for narcotics in 1 year. Town of 3,000 people. And nobody said anything. So you just wonder how many people were asleep at the switch. So I hope the money is used to help improve drug treatment access, and really build high quality programs where treatment success is the rule, not the exception. One of the things that has to be linked to it, and this is, I'm working and talked a lot with Bobby Kennedy about this, because he's not shy about talking about his own substance abuse problem that he had for many years. When my son finished his treatment, he was so excited. He called me 14 months, hardest thing he ever did in his life. He's now off drugs, and he later got off alcohol, and then he later got off tobacco products. But the hardest thing he did in his life, and he had 36 job interviews after he got out of 14 months. And all 36 companies turned him down because he once used drugs. How does he get a job? How does he get a start? So Kennedy and I are looking at programs that and I was CDC director, I asked AT&T and the banking and telecom industry, I need you guys' help. You need to help us on this drug treatment stuff. You need to be able to provide mentorship, internships for these people as they come out of drug treatment so they can have a job. So it's it's really sad. After you've been turned down 36 times, it's kind of hard to go back and want to stand and get turned down again. Particularly, it's when you get turned down for something that you're not proud of, which you shouldn't be. I always said that stigma is the enemy of public health, and I always told my son he should never be ashamed of who he is. He had a medical condition. Unfortunately, it's a chronic recurrent medical condition, and I pray every day that he stays in rehab, stays in remission. But anyhow, I do think we've got to reinvest that money into treatment opportunities for people that are struggling with addiction and struggling with recovery.
Thanks very much. What is your solution for the fentanyl crisis, which the country is enduring and has been enduring for now quite some time?
Yeah, I think it's a tragedy. As you know, when I was CDC director the first year, I lost 80,000 people. I think we had 120,000 people that the day I left died that year. And we're still losing a substantial number of people, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people a year. I think we have to get serious about enforcement, and I would be probably much more aggressive in trying to go after importation of this drug. I obviously would be much more aggressive in my relationship and partnership with China that want to cooperate with us to help us try to minimize this drug. I would do the same thing with Mexico, which is manufacturing a lot of this drug with product from. But, truthfully, if I had to shut down the border and open every single truck and every single package and do that for a year, I'd do that. I mean, we're losing an enormous number of people from this. And as you know, now it's really problematic because now fentanyl is in a lot of products that people don't know what's in. It's in Percocet, it's in amphetamines. It's like my son. My son didn't take fentanyl. He took cocaine. It just was tainted with fentanyl. So no, I think we have to really go after the source. We have to get cooperation. I mean, with China to help us, and Mexico. And I think we have to be very firm with people that are involved in the distribution of illegal narcotics.
Has the situation improved regarding China since the Xi-Biden agreement that China would do something about fentanyl?
I don't know the answer. I would turn to you. You may know more. They say they want to do something. I know President Trump said the same thing when he talked to Xi about this, but I don't know.
Yeah, I hear the situation has improved, but I'm unclear how much it has improved. Right, thank you very much. We have one final question, and we are also running out of time. So, Katie, would you like to ask that question?
Yes, absolutely. The question that I had was in terms of the biological national security threats that you cited throughout this evening, are there any countries beyond China that you believe pose a risk to biosecurity? And furthermore, is there a chance that the trend toward increased scientific and technological development in more developing countries could actually increase this risk?
I wouldn't point out China as a unique threat. All right. I think, as I mentioned, the Wuhan laboratory was a U.S. China experiment gone bad. So it wasn't a China. you know, I do get nervous about countries that may see this as well. I do get nervous about countries that don't have the ability to do biocontainment to get involved in gain of function research. I don't think they should be involved in it. Personally, I think we should have a global moratorium on it until we can figure out who can do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way. I do think there are risks as for bioterrorism in countries that feel their defensive and offensive options are limited. Because this is a pretty simple one to bring to bear. I used to tell people, for probably with a couple postdocs, molecular biology postdocs, and a couple $100,000, I could weaponize Ebola. Enough to cause havoc in the world. Now some people who disagree with me say it's not practical that we could get the world to agree to do a moratorium on gain of function research, therefore we shouldn't do it. Well, we could say the same thing about climate control or anything. I just think the United States should lead in trying to develop a more responsible way to take the power of biomedical research that we have right now and make sure it's supplied for public good and not accidentally in trying to do that cause a public chaos. And again, I would think that people would be more attuned to listening to my argument post-COVID, because I think COVID caused a lot of public harm. When we were at the Heritage Foundation and we're looking at accountability, we've assessed that the COVID pandemic cost the United States approximately $9 trillion. And a lot of that could be attributed to delays in implementing the international health regulations. That's why the concern about accountability to China. But I don't want that to be attributed that we think somehow China was uniquely responsible for the laboratory experiments, because that's not true. I've always been an advocate that the United States has an enormous responsibility in that, along with China. It's not unique to China at all.
Mm-hmm. Let me just squeeze in a question which I just noticed only by Richard Ford. He asks about Donald Trump again. He says, in John Bolton's book, Bolton says that Trump would switch from one decision to another based on the views of the last person with whom he spoke. What do you say about that? That is totally untrue, or it is quite correct?
I do think that Trump had a tendency. I give one story. It might be how convincing the voice was, because in my situation, the decisions he made that I asked him to make, he made, and he didn't revise them. He made them. But I will tell you that after the election, I walked into the Oval Office and he was there at the Resolute desk, and I had to brief him on something. I don't remember what it was. And when I finished, I said, Mr. President, I haven't done this before, but I just feel compelled to share with you some a perspective and advice. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, you lost the election. You should congratulate Joe Biden. And you should plan to take a victory lap for all the really important things you've accomplished in your presidency, like the Abraham Accords, like the economy, like what we did. He did a thing with me to get an end to the AIDS epidemic in America by 2030, actually going after flavored tobacco products. You guys don't know, it's not in the public domain, but he really did, I think, instrumentally keep us out of a major conflict with someone in Asia. He did a lot of great things, and I said, take a victory lap for it. And I thought he really listened to me. And then I walked out, and the people coming in after me was the mayor from New York and that woman lawyer that was giving him terrible advice, and a series of congressmen and senators that told him he didn't lose the election. So he does sometimes listen to what people say, and sometimes people that have the last word might influence his opinion. But that was never the case in when I dealt with him. When we dealt on serious issues, he made a decision. It was decisive. He didn't revisit it, and he stuck his guns with it. So I would probably disagree with Josh, who I know and I respect. He's grew up in Baltimore, went to a local high school around the corner. But I do think Trump was influenced by people that make arguments with him. If you were going to make an argument with Trump to do something, you're better off being the last one in line.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Redfield. It has been a great pleasure. It has been insightful, and we have been informed an awful lot about the many things you mentioned in terms of America's health policy, COVID-19, and perhaps the future epidemics still to come, which of course we hope you are not correct in this instance. But it certainly was most interesting to listen to you, to engage with you in a conversation. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for the two Krasno assistants, Katie and Emmeline. And of course, thank you very much to the audience who has stuck with us until the bitter end. And I would like to invite you to our next Krasno events, which will come in the next few weeks. I will let you know in due course. And once again, Dr. Robert Redfield, thank you very much for joining us here at the Krasno Global Event Series. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much, Klaus.